first, I mean, the saying, what they say that if you want to change the world, change your home. Um, and I think there's a lot of truth in that, that at this point, it's the job of every parish to honor the people that they have in their parish, and so and that's going to look different in every parish in terms of meshing sort of this fault line between the reality of the last several decades and where things might be going. And I think there is, with some diplomacy and with some communication, I definitely think it's possible to bridge that fault line and look forward to what kind of music would best serve that parish moving forward. And then zooming out from that, then of course, once you get out of the just the Greek tradition and you start looking across the other jurisdictions, um, I I think that there is so much good music, really wonderful music that is being composed now. I mean, look at what Benedict Sheehan is doing. He's OCA, but there's so much going on that I think that there's a wealth of opportunity here to keep an open mind and see. Uh, uh, l- Let me say it like this. I think that there, especially in Orthodox circles, there's a tendency to say, well, we are the ancient church and nothing has changed and nothing should ever change. That's really not true. I mean, I think we all understand the spirit of where that's coming from, but we have changed. And I think our challenge is to figure out how to allow for liturgical art, for lack of of a better word, to embrace some of these really quality new compositions, to give them voice as is appropriate in
about the end times. They divide the countries, the United States and Israel, usually they're on the side of good, and I suppose some other nations that they approve of, they're on the side of good, but then those evil Gog and Magog, those evil empires, they're like, the Russians or the Chinese or the Iranians or the Iraqis or whoever is considered to be the enemy at the moment. This is not true, because in the book of Revelation, the division is not along the lines of political ideology, but along spiritual lines. So God is with the good, and everybody else, or those who do evil, are with the evil powers. And human governments can be used for good and for evil. And most governments are a mixture of both. And even though people may have their personal motivations to have power and influence that might inspire some people to become involved in government, I do believe, and maybe I'm naive, but I do believe that most people and most governments really want the best for their country. And it's unfortunate that the political dialogue in this country has become so sensitive, so highly charged, that it's quite difficult to have any kind of discussion. If you're a Republican, well, you're basically a Nazi. You're you're an extremist. You hate the poor and immigrants, and you have no heart. They're the worst things. On the other hand, if you're a Democrat, well, you're a bleeding heart liberal, and you don't love your country and that sort of thing. So these are really mistakes. No, either political party or no person or no nation is 100% good. We are all created good by God, but then we choose sometimes to do evil things. So we're going to look at this passage here at the beginning of Romans chapter 13, where Paul makes comments about governing authorities. And these comments have been used, they've really been misused throughout the centuries by governments to tell people to basically shut up and obey what we tell you to do. So is that what Paul is advocating here? So we're going to take a look at that. We have some nice patristic readings today, and we'll just talk about the relationship between Christians and government. Let's begin by reading Romans chapter 13. This is verses 1 through 7. And this is the Revised Standard Version. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. And those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, he who resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of him who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. He is the servant of God to execute his wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be subject, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For the same reason, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay all of them their dues. Taxes to whom taxes are due, revenue to whom revenue is due, respect to whom respect is due, honor to whom honor is due. So this passage has been much discussed, and it's rather controversial. It's been very influential, as I mentioned, and many rulers, particularly kings in the past, demanded obedience based on this text. And their policies and discussions and theologies that they supported on the basis of this text. And this is often called the divine right of kings. That's what this has traditionally been called. In other words, kings used to say to their subjects, God put me here. You need to obey me because I'm placed here by God. And last time I sort of introduced this subject to you by saying, how are we supposed to, asking you to think about, how are we supposed to understand this passage? Because this seems kind of naive, doesn't it? Is Paul an idealist here? Is he immature? Is he just projecting wishful thinking to say that if you resist the authorities, you're resisting God, and the rulers have been instituted by God? Is really this what Paul is saying? Was Paul sort of out of his mind here? What is the reason why we have this kind of a statement, this whole passage? Because it was not easy to be a Christian in the first century. There, if you talk about ruling authorities and governing authorities, there were Jewish ones too, you know. And Paul often suffered at the hands of ruling authorities. He was beaten. Of course, he was ultimately beheaded. So is Paul assuming that worldly leaders always act in the interests of their subjects? Does he consider the fact that they often abuse their power, that often there is a miscarriage of justice? Does it have to do with who you are in society? Maybe you're more likely to support authority when it benefits you, when you are maybe in a position, I know this is like a very touchy word, privilege, a position of privilege, or you are behind, you know, you have a particular race, because the truth is that the experiences that people have within a government often does depend upon their status, their race. This is a reality. And there are places where the government is so corrupt that people do not trust governing authorities at all. And I live 30 minutes from the Mexican border. And, you know, the Mexican government is very much controlled in a lot of ways. They're not, you know, by the drug cartels. They're doing their best, but it's not an easy situation, because anyone who tries to bring order and to take control of the border on the Mexican side, they don't have the money, the equipment, the firearms that the drug cartels have. And people who have tried have ended up dead. Anyone who's tried to bring order to these neighboring towns across the border have often, but they just give up because they're killed. So this is a real issue. So what is Paul telling us here? What was his relationship with the government? Even though at Paul's time there was a Caesar, and today we do not usually have kings in the world. There aren't too many kings who actually wield power. Today we have usually governments that derive their power from the consent of the people. We have elected governments. We have representative governments. But nonetheless, what Paul is saying here still applies even to those of us who are living not under kings, but under representative forms of government. So how do we explain the presence of this passage? I mentioned this to you last week, I remember. Some people think that this is an interpolation, a gloss, or an insertion by someone who wanted to encourage Christians to be obedient to authorities. And they say that Paul couldn't be so naive as to say, oh, these authorities come from God. So obviously he did not write this. This is the conclusion that some people have drawn. And because that Paul often speaks about Christians having true citizenship in heaven. And Jesus thought this too, right? Our true citizenship is in heaven. We are only here temporarily. And later in this chapter, Paul talks about the nearness of the end, that the end time is approaching. So why would he then be focused here on worldly powers and being subject to worldly governing authorities? So some people simply say, well, Paul never really wrote this. Somebody inserted this later. And how would they do this? Well, because all books like the epistles of Paul were hand copied. So Paul wrote one copy of Romans. He sent it to the Church of Rome with Phoebe, and it was read. And then copies were made of it, and copies were made of those, and copies and copies and copies. So it was easy if you didn't agree with something, or you wanted to, if you wanted to add something to what Paul said, it was easy to insert a comment. All right. So this is the argument behind that. Well, the problem with this, and I've read this idea in other passages that people don't like of St. Paul, the argument against this being what's called a gloss or an interpolation, an addition, is that a couple of them, there's a couple of reasons against it. First of all, in this greater section, earlier in chapter 12, remember when Paul wrote this, he didn't put chapter numbers. These were added later. So earlier in what we call chapter 12, Paul was talking about how Christians ought to live in relationship with each other, both in the church and with people outside the church, how we ought to treat enemies. Remember that discussion about the hot coals and all this? So it's harder to make the argument that this section was added later because it seems to fit the general instructions here. Because now he's going from the church relationship between members of the church to the relationship between Christians and people who are outside of the church, and now to the broader society, to our relationship with governments, you see. So it fits. If there's something that seems really out of place, then it's more obvious that it could be an insertion. But here, you can't really make that argument because the subject matter fits the general discussion of the passage, the context of what is being discussed. Another argument against this being an addition, an interpolation, is that this section is found in every manuscript copy. If someone was to, so it's very difficult to argue that this was added later because you can't go around and collect all the copies of the book of Romans, even soon after he wrote it. Soon after he wrote it, it would have been copied very, very soon after he wrote it because there was more than one Christian congregation in Rome and it would have been read at all of them. So let's say there's 10 Christian congregations in Rome. Very soon after this epistle reached Rome, there would have been a number of copies. And you'd have to find all of them, rewrite it, and insert this passage with exactly the same wording. So it's pretty much impossible. You see my point? So there's no way that this is an interpolation, that this was an addition by someone other than Paul, because this passage is not absent from any of the manuscript copies. So let's say that Paul wrote this epistle in the year 58. It was sent to Rome, and 8 or 10 copies were made relatively quickly that were only present in the city of Rome, and they were read by the Roman Christians. So let's say within a couple of years you have 8 copies. Those copies would have then been copied by other people later, and then those copies would have been copied, and those copies would have been copied. That's how books were disseminated. There was no place that you went to get all the books or all the letters of Paul, nothing like that. It was sort of random. It was kind of haphazard. But there is no manuscript copy of Romans that's missing this passage. You see, that's pretty strong evidence that this was something that Paul himself actually wrote. Another consideration for reason why this is not an interpolation, not something that was added after Paul wrote the letter, is because Paul was probably aware that there was a significant degree of civil unrest and dissatisfaction in Rome at this time, the late 50s, and a lot of it had to do with taxes. So this is why he mentions at the end, pay your taxes to those to whom taxes is due, and revenue or tribute to those to whom tribute is due. So the Roman Empire had a lot of expenses, and just as we don't like to be taxed, especially to be taxed heavily or unfairly, people didn't like it then either, and they were just getting by, and they had to pay these taxes. So it's possible, actually, one of Nero's early actions is to try to reform the tax system to eliminate some abuses that were happening. That's when he was getting good advice and he hadn't gone off the deep end and was acting irrationally and doing bizarre things. So this was very relatively early. This was a significant issue at the time. Let's just say that way. So Paul, it's not surprising that Paul would have addressed the question of our responsibility to governing authorities and whether or not we're responsible to pay taxes or tribute to governing authorities. It's logical that he would have addressed this, knowing full well the kind of unrest, by the way, not only in the city of Rome, but throughout the Roman Empire. This was a huge issue for the Jews as well. This was a big, big issue. People were being taxed, tremendously. And it affects people in their ability to survive. And you didn't have a choice to pay the taxes or not. So Paul definitely wrote this passage. So we're going to eliminate this idea that Paul didn't write this. But you should know that it is not uncommon for some Bible scholars to simply dismiss a passage by saying, Paul didn't write this. There is no way that Paul wrote this. Paul wouldn't think this way. And unfortunately, that's really not a good way to analyze and explain a passage that we don't understand or agree with. That, unfortunately, that Paul didn't write this has been a kind of fallback position for many Bible scholars. And it's a kind of easy cop-out to avoid really dealing with the passage. What is the real meaning of this passage? Why did Paul say this? So we see this not only here, but in a couple of other places. I'll give you, among the more famous, is some of the statements by Paul, let the women remain silent, that kind of a passage. So that seems to be so contradictory to what we know about St. Paul, his relationship with women, female teachers like Priscilla, and of course with Jesus having female disciples. So one of the ways that people have dealt with these difficult passages is to simply say there's no way that Paul wrote this, somebody else wrote this, either the entire epistle or some particular passage that it was inserted later by somebody trying to keep women oppressed or something like this. That's a real cop-out. It's not the best way to handle these passages. Unless there is manuscript evidence that a particular passage was not originally part of a book, we should never make that our fallback argument. We can ignore this because Paul would not have written this, somebody else wrote this. There are very few places like that. There are some verses in the New Testament that seem to have been added later. And I should say that probably the most obvious and one that we're absolutely certain about is in the Gospel of John, the story of Jesus and the adulterous woman. So that one was definitely added later. It's not present in the earliest manuscripts. But we've already discussed that when we talked about the Gospel of John. So definitely Paul wrote this. So why did he write this? Why did he say these things? Well, some people say, well, at this time, Paul had a pretty positive view of the Roman government. I don't know that I agree with that. I think Paul had a very realistic view of Roman government. And of course, we knew that later, not too much later after this, maybe within 6 years, Paul lost his head under the Roman government. Literally, he lost his head. And Paul knew also, remember, Paul is a Jewish Christian. Paul doesn't say, I'm not a Hebrew, I'm not Jewish anymore. He considered himself Jewish, right? He's from the tribe of Benjamin. He's a Hebrew. He's an Israelite. He describes himself this way. And the Jews do not have such a smooth and cooperative relationship with the Roman government. So to say that Paul, simply had a positive view of the Roman government, this is why he said it, that also doesn't hold much water. Not to mention the fact that what we call Christianity was not a separate religion at this time. We forget that. Oh, it's, the Jews were at odds with the Romans, but he wanted the Christians to be, get along with Rome. Well, most Christians at this time were Jewish Christians. Most of them had come to the faith through the synagogue. And they didn't have a separate sort of relationship with Rome that was different than other Jews. They thought of themselves as Jews. They were just Jews who believed in Jesus as the Messiah. So you can't make the argument that Christianity is separate, and so there was a more positive view, whereas for the Jews, it was a more negative view. Other people would say that Paul was anxious to encourage Christians to be obedient to Rome so that they would avoid conflict with Rome and this kind of a thing. Others say that Paul was emphasizing the coming age because later at the end of this chapter, in the end of chapter 13, he's talking about eschatology. That's the end times. The eschaton is the Greek word for end times. The eschaton is the end times. And that Paul is just encouraging Christians to get along, to live in this world and deal with certain realities and get along with this world, knowing very well that we are here for only a brief period of time. Other people say that this section is paranesis, a word I've used many times for you. It's words of encouragement, words of advice, words of exhortation, that this simply reflects typical Hellenistic ideas. And there were, in a typical Greek letter of the time, it was common to encourage good behavior, long ago when parents actually wrote letters to their children away in college, they would say, now be sure you eat all your vegetables, study hard, sit up straight, this kind of thing, work hard, you can become president one day. These kinds of things, these words of advice and encouragement were common also in a Greek letter. And some people say, because we're in the paranetic section, that this simply reflects, in other words, Paul borrowed this kind of general idea from a typical Greek letter. But even if many Greek letters sort of encouraged people to be obedient, to be law-abiding, to respect authority, and they did, there's this general idea that order in society is good. Even if this is the case, why would Paul write this? Is Paul just sort of copying from some Greek letters and he doesn't really believe it? Of course not. Remember that everything Paul is concerned about, Paul is concerned about the spiritual life. Yes, there are certain practicalities, but Paul is concerned about how we live in this world because it impacts us in the next life, right? It impacts our salvation. So Paul isn't just copying this because, I guess since I'm writing to the Romans, I guess I'll throw in some comments about, obeying governing authorities because, that's kind of found in typical Greek letters. I don't think that's what Paul is doing here. Paul really believes that there is an important principle at work here, and that it was important to for the spiritual welfare of the Christians in Rome and of the church in general. So, what does it stand for? Well, of course, he's encouraging the observance of secular laws. He's encouraging respect for the state and encouraging us to perform our civic duties, to vote, to serve on juries if we're called to do so, to participate in civic life to the extent that we can, to be informed that the government itself is not evil. Some people identified the government with evil, but Paul says government itself is not evil. Civil authority is given by God, and we have to be involved in it to some extent for the good of all. And this does not mean that just because God allows civil authority that every particular ruler is approved of by God. That's a different matter. Okay? They're accountable to God. So the question now really is, for us today, what did Paul intend and what message does this passage have for us? How do we apply it to our lives today? So we're at the half hour. We're going to take a break at this point, and when we come back, we will continue this discussion of ruling authorities and our responsibilities to them whether or not we can dissent from them and under what circumstances we should. What would Paul say about that? So join me after the break.
Dr. Constantinou will be back in a moment, but the lines are open for your calls. The number is 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF Radio.
So here's a question for you. What does it mean to think Orthodox? What are the unspoken and unexplored premises and presumptions underlying what Christians believe? Orthodox Christianity is based on preserving the mind of the early church, its phronima. Dr. Jeannie Constantinou brings her more than 40 years' experience as a professor, Bible teacher, and speaker to bear in explaining what the Orthodox phronima is, how it can be acquired, and how that phronima is expressed in true Orthodox theology, as practiced by those who are properly qualified by both training and a deep relationship with Christ. Thinking Orthodox, now available at store.ancientfaith.com. That's store.ancientfaith.com.
We are back with Search the Scriptures Live with Dr. Jeannie Constantinou. Have a question about the verses we are studying tonight? Give her a call at 855-237-2346. Here once again is Dr. Jeannie.
Okay, so what do we make of this passage? How do we apply it? How do we understand it? Because we're reading this because, we believe that the scriptures are supposed to be instructive for us. So we have to deal with this particular passage. Now, the relationship between the church and the state is complicated. It differs with time and place. There's a difference today between the relationship between the Russian Orthodox Church and Russia today than it was under the Soviet Union, right? And frankly, Greece today, because the church is kind of a state church in Greece today, it's a little bit different today than it was a few years ago, because now today Greece is part of the European Union. And the European Union is attempting in some cases to pressure the Greek state to do things like remove certain religious symbols from classrooms and things like this. Greek classrooms, Greek education begins with the Trisagion prayers. Okay, below the way Americans would salute the flag, or you might sing your national anthem, and they don't want that. Okay, so the European Union has been sort of opposed to these kinds of things and trying to remove, and it's very difficult, believe me, in Greece, to remove the intertwined relationship between the church and the Greek people and the Greek government. In the United States, we've had a lot of issues in recent years in which we're struggling with the rights of people to exercise religious freedom versus the sponsorship or establishment of religion. And in recent years, there has been more and more state interference in religious liberties. There have been some very famous cases in the United States where, for example, Christian bakers, people who had a bakery, and were asked to bake a wedding cake for a homosexual marriage. They refused to do this, and the fact is, the story behind the scenes is that the homosexual couple was really targeting this business. They knew that these people were Christians and they wanted to make an example of them. And they were sued, and they actually lost their business because they couldn't afford to stay in business because they lost. It was seen as discriminatory. They said, we can't in our good conscience bake a wedding cake for a homosexual wedding. They refused to do it. They ended up losing their business and having to close their shop. In another case, there was a very similar case in Colorado. The first one was in Oregon. The other one in Colorado, he actually won the case and he was able to remain. But these people who attempted to assert their religious liberties, they were vilified in the press, in the media. Many Christians, of course, came to their defense, but they were vilified. But other people said, well, you can't be able to discriminate in this way because now homosexuals are a protected class in the United States. In other words, you can't discriminate against them. So this is a problem. We can understand a protected class when race is involved, but what about something that is a moral issue? And that's what we have in the case of homosexuality. When Obama passed the Affordable Care Act, that was universal health care here in the United States, that required businesses to provide contraception. And many Catholic institutions were opposed to that, and also some evangelical Christians. There's a very famous case called Hobby Lobby, and that was a privately owned family business. It's a very big chain of stores that sell kind of craft products. And they were sued because they refused to provide this. And they actually won in the United States Supreme Court. But it was not easy for them. And there were Catholic nuns called the Little Sisters of the Poor. The government demanded that they pay for artificial contraception. And they didn't want to do that. And they actually also won their case. But it's not easy. These are real issues. And, people, they take years to work their way through the courts. They take a lot of time. They take a lot of money. And these are real issues that we will continue to face as the church becomes increasingly more at odds with the general culture. Because there was a time when the culture was much more supportive of the church, of churches in general. Was much more supportive of churches in general, but the tide seems to be shifting away from that, and we may see more and more situations like this. So what if the government, your government, wherever you are listening to this program, was to say that the Orthodox Church must ordain women as priests, or it must ordain openly homosexual men, otherwise, or women, I guess. Otherwise, it is discriminatory, and they begin to suppress it or tax it, or there's all kinds of measures. This is not an impossibility. I can easily see this happening, that there are repressive measures that are taken against churches and against people of faith by people who don't believe in the values that the Christian church espouses. Now, recently, of course, all of us lived through many questions and issues that arose between the churches and the state because of COVID. The government closed our churches. Basically, they said you are not allowed to gather together in an enclosed space. In some countries, in some states, everything was closed. In others, there were certain businesses that were allowed to remain open, like, believe it or not, liquor stores. That was one thing that really got people upset here in the United States. Liquor stores, and also some home improvement stores like Home Depot, big stores, Walmart, they were open, and churches had to remain closed. Okay, synagogues were closed. So, the government decided what was essential and what was not. And obviously the people making those decisions don't really care that much about church. They must not be church-going people because they didn't think that going to church, receiving communion was essential. And I told you about this last time, the city of Toronto, not the entire province of Ontario, but the city of Toronto in Canada forbade the use of the common communion spoon. That's really crossing over the line because now they're interfering in liturgical practice. That was pretty shocking. When I read that I didn't believe it at first. I thought, how could any government tell you how to administer communion? And if you administer it in this way, you're in violation of the law. They literally closed the churches and the Greek Orthodox churches in the city of Toronto. So these are very difficult questions. And the courts, which are an arm of the government, have been used to suppress and even persecute Christians and other groups. And by the way, I was reading about this recently. I thought this was very, very interesting. Not just Christians, but also other groups, Muslims and others. But today it seems like, I hate to say this, but if you're a Christian, you're more likely to be targeted than if you belong to some other group because it's more politically correct to target Christians than other groups. But I was pretty shocked to read that in the mid-1800s in the province of Quebec, Canada, Jews literally did not have the right to exist. They were not allowed. I was reading about the history of Quebec. And Jews were not allowed to register births and deaths or marriage. Because the relationship between the Catholic Church and the province of Quebec was very, very strong. And the Jews literally were in legal limbo. They literally did not have any legal existence in the province of Quebec. That was ended, of course, a long time ago. But you can see how the government can both use and misuse religious authorities to promote their own ideas. So to what extent do we recognize the authority of the government? Well, the government has certain responsibilities. During the COVID outbreak, well, the government is responsible for trying to keep us safe and healthy. This is true. And I think that I really, truly believe that most people really are doing what they think is best. I think that this is true. We don't always agree with them, but I do believe that people are genuinely sincere and genuinely doing what they believe is best. We might not agree with them that churches are not essential, but they think that you don't have to go to church. They think that what they're doing is best. So we've all had discussions about this. So what is our relationship between our responsibility as good citizens, wherever we live, because most churches obeyed the government and they closed their doors, or they, after a while, they started to meet outdoors, this kind of thing. But not all of them. Some churches refused to obey, and some synagogues in New York and in California, there were lawsuits that were brought against the government for what we call here equal protection. So, in other words, the churches and synagogues, and this is true, were treated unfairly. Because if you can allow people to gather indoors, for example, at 50% capacity, but churches can only gather indoors at 25% capacity, that's violating our guarantee of equal protection under the law. So a church here in San Diego sued the government and won, the state of California, and a synagogue, some Jews in New York sued because the restrictions were more severe for churches than for businesses that were operating indoors. And they won in a case in the United States Supreme Court. So the government has to be fair. Now, and treat the churches equally to governments, to businesses. Now, in other parts of the world, in Greece, some clergy were saying, if you wear a mask, don't come to church because you obviously don't have enough faith. If you've been vaccinated, this is a terrible thing. In other words, you're denying Christ. Some people, I know this, literally said you cannot get sick in church. If you come to church, you're in a bubble and you can't get sick in church. I was actually accused of saying this, and I've never said this. I don't believe that. I don't believe that you can't get sick in church. There's a difference between saying you can't get sick from Holy Communion and saying you can't get sick in church. Obviously, you can, because there were priests and bishops, not to mention faithful, who did get sick from COVID, and some died. So for us to say, I have enough faith so that I will not wear a mask, and I believe that God will protect me, that's really to put God to the test, right? Because that's what the devil said to the Lord. Why don't you just jump off of this cliff? Because God will send his angels and they'll catch you. If you have enough faith, if you are the Son of God, that's the way he put it. Well, if you have enough faith, you won't get the COVID vaccine or wear a mask. So I'm not trying to make a political statement here. I understand that people have reasons why they don't want to receive the vaccine, and I respect that. I respect the individual choice, but don't tempt the Lord. Don't make that a test of your faith, because here Paul is saying that we are supposed to do what we can to be obedient to, not more than just obedient, to submit to authorities where it is not a matter of faith. So some people were very extreme right. If you wear a mask, if you get a vaccine, you're not a good Orthodox Christian. Others were to the extreme left, and they said we should be using multiple communion spoons. You can't get sick from communion, but maybe from the spoon, and all these other things. So we had sides of the spectrum represented, unfortunately. And there was a lot of discussion about this. Priests did the best that they could. And I'm not critical of any bishops or priests who really, they did not know what to do. Here in San Diego, at least one of the priests was very reluctant to open up to greater capacity quickly. He knew of churches that did, and people got sick, and he didn't want to be responsible for people getting sick. And I respect that. I might have opened up more quickly than he did, but he's the priest. That's his call. He's responsible before God, and I respect that. I also respect the decisions of various bishops to handle it in the way that they thought is best. So I think as Christians, as Orthodox Christians, we should not be judgmental toward our clergy for the positions that they took, but we should avoid extremism. We should avoid taking extreme positions, either that we should use multiple spoons because God is not above science. This is what some Orthodox Christians were saying. God does not violate the laws of science, which is amazing to me because every miracle is a violation of the laws of science, and so is Holy Communion. It violates the laws of science because body and bread and wine become the body and blood of Christ. So we have people on that extreme. We have people on the other extreme. And extremism is not good. And it's not patristic. The fathers of the church did not like to take extremes on either side. They believed in the middle way, not to be extremely to the right or to the left. And don't make these things a litmus test of faith or of rationality. So I'm trying to remember what somebody said about me. Somebody said, it's too bad that I can't remember what they said. Somebody was criticizing me because I don't believe that we should be using multiple spoons. You probably know that. I don't think we can get sick from communion. Even when we're using a common spoon, there's absolutely no evidence of this. A common spoon has been used for 1,000 years. We're all still alive. The priests didn't die from diseases in the past. So I don't think that we should be using multiple spoons. But if a bishop or priest felt strongly that they should, I'm not going to be critical of them for that. I just don't accept it. And I think it's a dangerous position to take because it introduces doubt into the minds of the faithful. So this was my position on the spoons. But somebody was critical of me and said, I said you can't get sick in church. I never said that. And they also said it's such a shame that somebody who's so intelligent can be has magical thinking. That's what they said. That's what they said. Because I believe you can't get sick from the communion spoon. I have magical thinking. So I was dismissed as some kind of a crackpot, I guess. Anyhow, we shouldn't be arguing about these things. But we do recognize, especially in this recent experience that we had with COVID, that people make different responses to what their government is asking them to do. This is what we're talking about here. And we all, I hope, are just trying to do what we think is best. And we should respect each other's choices. And we shouldn't be labeling people as either, having magical thinking, or they don't have enough faith. Oh, Dr. Jeannie doesn't have enough faith, or she has too much faith and she's got magical thinking. This is inappropriate. Let people make the decisions that they think is best and not be judgmental toward them. These are not easy issues. And but religious persecution is a reality, and religion, as I mentioned, has become slightly, I think, disfavored in our culture because religious people are often portrayed as narrow-minded and bigoted. So I think it's important for us also not to portray that we have a positive, that we, in our actions, in our words, in our behavior, have a positive impact on the culture. So let's take a look at some of these verses. I've been talking for a long time about this. Let's take a look at some of the verses, verse by verse, of St. Paul here, and then we're going to look at what the fathers of the church say about it. What does Paul say in verse 1? Be subject. Let every person be subject to governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Be subject is much stronger than be obedient. Be subject is the word, ipotasome. We've sort of talked about this. Be subject. Ipotas Das ist tho. Subjection is different from ipakoi, obedience. It means to be subject means that you recognize that this person is in a position of authority, that this person has been placed in a position of authority. And when he says that there is no authority except that which is given from God, that means that this person has been placed or set, or the authorities, the government, has been allowed by God, is in place because of God. Now, don't jump to conclusions. We're going to talk about the other issues. Therefore, this is verse 2, he who resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. So we're not supposed to resist authority. So the people who said, well, this is what the government wants us to do right now to close the churches, and we don't agree with it, but we think that maybe for a brief period of time, we will change our behavior. We'll close the church for a couple of weeks or a couple of months, and we will then modify our opening. We'll meet outdoors. We will have a limited capacity. We'll find a way to make it work. People who made that decision are really in line with what Paul is saying here. That is what he is saying. Now, where are the people who take the Bible literally? Okay? Where are the people who say, well, it says right here, if you confess that Jesus is the Lord, you are saved. Isn't that the argument? You have to take it literally. Well, what did Paul say here? The one who resists authorities resists what God has appointed and will incur judgment. Why aren't they taking that verse literally? It's plain, it's straightforward, it's obvious. Isn't that really the argument? So can you see that the method of interpreting the Bible, which is very typical of Protestants, is completely subjective? I'm making a point here that's different from the authorities. I'm talking about the way Protestants have typically interpreted the Bible. So we have to, they've chosen the verses that they wish to understand literally, like if you confess with your lips that Jesus is Lord, you're going to be saved, and there's no question but you're going straight to heaven. That they take that very literally, but they're not taking this literally, right? They're not taking this is my body, this is my blood. They're not taking that literally. So unfortunately, there is no standard among Protestants for understanding what Paul means here. Because the standard for interpreting the Bible for many Protestants is simply their own opinion, their own individual opinion. But for Orthodox Christians, we look at the context. What is Paul intending to say? It seems very radical, I would say, very extreme. Obey the authorities, otherwise you're going to have the judgment of God. These people have been put here by God. So how do we know what Paul meant? Because is Paul saying you not only have to obey authorities, be subject to them? Why would somebody interpret that? How can we possibly interpret that literally? And if you're not interpreting it literally, why can you interpret some other passages literally? Why doesn't that same standard, that same technique apply here? Because Christians don't want that interpretation to apply here. Okay? So how do we know when to apply what interpretation? How do we know what Paul meant? This is what I'm getting at. Is it whatever I think, whatever Dr. Jeannie thinks, whatever you think? Because that's what a lot of Christians say. Well, I have the Holy Spirit, therefore, whatever I think it means, that's what it means. But then it's every man or woman for himself. That's the Protestant world. That's why the Protestant world is so fragmented. It cannot be correct, because then the interpretation is completely subjective, completely idiosyncratic, it's completely personal, and the meaning of a passage is only what that individual decides it means. And that can't be right, because the Holy Spirit is not the spirit of division or confusion. It's a spirit of unity. It's a spirit of peace. So the Holy Spirit cannot be telling me that it means this and telling somebody else that it means something else. Okay? So it can't be what we think it means. So what does it mean? How do we know what it means? It means what Paul understood it to mean, and we know what Paul meant by it because of the tradition of the church. That is, how did the church always understand the relationship between church and state, between Christians and their government. That's holy tradition. Tradition is not baklava, circle dances, other pierogies and other things. Holy tradition is what has the church always taught. That's how we interpret what Paul means here. And he's not saying we're supposed to give absolute obedience and be completely subject to the government and do what they say. Otherwise, Paul would be worshiping the Roman gods, right? Because wasn't that required? And of course, he cannot mean that. So let's look at the context and look at what the church has always understood this passage to mean. So, first of all, the church has taught that rulers derive their authority from God and owe their position to divine will. And by the way, that was a common belief in the ancient world. And there was this idea that to resist the authorities is to resist God. If you doubt what I'm saying, the Romans personified the Roman state. It was the goddess Roma, and they worshipped her. So the Greeks also, if you remember something from like the Iliad, where you had the Greek gods sort of took sides between the Troy and the Greeks from Greece, and in the Trojan War, you have the way the story is told, they kind of got involved and they helped both sides. So this idea that divine powers were behind human ruling authorities was very pervasive in the ancient world, but Paul does not disagree with that entirely. Okay? First of all, he believes that there is a practical good that is brought about by authority, and so does St. John Chrysostom. So it is good for us to obey authorities because they are beneficial to us. Paul is not saying that every ruler is specifically chosen by God, only that order, societal order, and rule itself is ordained by God. This is something that is given by God. Rule and society, government is something that is chosen and of God, government itself, not a particular government or a particular ruler. And also that there are some people who are ruled and other people who are in the position of rulers, and that this is a work of God's wisdom. That's why Paul says here, there is no power except by God. He doesn't mean the individual person, but all power comes from God. All authority comes from God. And this is how St. John Chrysostom understands this passage. And Chrysostom makes an analogy here with marriage. So God instituted marriage, right? He created Adam and Eve, and he said, let a man leave his father and his mother and cling to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. That's in Genesis. So this is good, right? And this is something instituted by God, marriage. That does not mean that every married couple is meant to be together, okay? Because sometimes marriage works for the benefit of somebody, but sometimes it can cause evils because it can be something detrimental to an individual person. Can you see that? This is Chrysostom's analogy. He says that the discipline which the rule of law brings, including the threat of punishment if we disobey, makes our lives better, makes our virtue, the pursuit of virtue, easier. So, continuing here in verse 3, for rulers are not a terror to good judgment, but to bad. For he does not wear the sword to no purpose. So this is what Paul is saying. Now, Paul is saying that rulers are a terror to, not to good conduct, but to bad. Now, you might say, well, there's been plenty of cases where people were targeted by rulers. But generally speaking, the idea here is that mostly what rulers want is an orderly society where people obey the laws and we can live in peace with each other. So what does he mean when he says to be subject for conscience' sake? Therefore, this is verse 5, one must be subject not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. And for this reason, you also pay taxes, for authorities are, listen to this, ministers of God. liturgi theou, and they attend to this very thing. So, on the subject of taxes, let's take a break at this moment. And when we return, we will talk about the subject of taxes, everybody's favorite topic. And then we'll also hear from St. John Chrysostom and a couple of very early saints on this subject. Okay, so join me after the break.
Dr. Constantinou will be back in a moment, but the lines are open for your calls. The number is 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF Radio.
No end of books these days offer us techniques for self-improvement. But in the newest release from the Ancient Faith store, Gratitude in Life's Trenches, Robin Phillips takes a different tack. He shows us that God meets us where we are, in the pain and heartache of the present moment. Instead of looking for a way to escape from hardship, we can cultivate an attitude of gratitude, peace, and self-acceptance that will transform our experience of suffering. Drawing on his own experiences and his work as a consultant in the behavioral health industry, as well as stories of saints and sufferers, teachings of the fathers, and recent discoveries in neuroscience, Phillips shows us that the journey to personal well-being is one we can all travel, regardless of the hardships we may face. To find this book and others like it, you can go to store.ancientfaith.com. Again, that is store.ancientfaith.com.
We are back with Search the Scriptures Live with Dr. Jeannie Constantinou. Have a question about the verses we are studying tonight? Give her a call at 855-237-2346. Here once again is Dr. Jeannie.
All right, so St. Paul is telling us in Romans chapter 13, verses 6 and 7, to pay our taxes. Pay taxes to whom tax is due, revenue to whom revenue is due, respect to whom respect is due, honor to whom honor is due. So, for example, when we talk about respect and honor, even if you don't like President Biden, he's still the president. So you should call him Mr. President. Even if you didn't like Trump, he was the president. So he deserves to be respected as the president. So this is what he's talking about, to give honor and respect to the people who have these positions, even if, and by the way, the same thing would go in the church. Even if you don't like what the bishop is doing or what the priest is doing, you don't agree with him, the same thing goes for worldly authorities. We're supposed to give them the respect of their position, of their office. This is what he's saying here. Now, we've seen Jesus make this same statement, right? Is it lawful to pay tribute to Caesar or not? And then the whole thing with the coin, right? Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar. So Jesus was not opposed to paying taxes. He recognized the responsibility of citizens to pay taxes. And then later, there's another story found only in the Gospel of Matthew, in which Peter and Jesus are both supposed to pay the temple tax, which was half a shekel for every adult Jewish man, and they didn't have the money. And he says, what are we going to do about the temple tax? Are we supposed to pay the tax? The tax collectors came looking for Jesus and Peter. It's quite interesting when you think about it. And the Lord told Peter to go to the lake and to cast a line and catch a fish. And inside the mouth of the fish was the shekel to pay the taxes. So he didn't say, even though he does make a comment that he felt that he didn't know the tax. Jesus believed he didn't know the tax, but he paid it. Okay? There, you have to read that for yourself. Someday we'll talk about the Gospel of Matthew. We'll discuss that passage. But he said the sons are free. The tribute is given by not by the sons, but by the subjects of the king. And therefore, the sons are free. He's calling himself the son there, and says that we don't. Basically, he's saying we don't really owe the tax, but so as to not cause offense, we'll pay it. Go to the lake and cast a line and pay the tax. So Paul is saying that Christians should be good citizens. He's not saying that we must obey civil authorities in religious matters, in matters of doctrine or practice. That can't be the case, because otherwise Paul would be worshiping the Roman gods. So do you remember in Romans 12, he said, if it is possible, as far as it depends upon you, live peaceably with all. So the power of the government is not absolute, but the institutions power itself, all power comes from God, and it is permitted by God. Even if the powers are corrupt, still they are permitted by God. If you think about this, think about Revelation chapter 13, Revelation 13, not Romans, but Revelation 13:7. What does it say when it describes the beast of the sea, which is making war against the saints? He says that the beast of the sea was allowed to make war on the saints and conquer them. So God allows things sometimes, even bad rulers, even bad governments. God allows it. So we do what we can. We are respectful as much as possible. We are obedient to the extent possible, not in anything that's harmful to us spiritually, but if it's not harmful to us, we try to get along with the authorities. So Paul is affirming not that every particular government and ruler is given to us by God, that particular person, and that everything they do is correct. He's not saying that at all. He's affirming the general idea of government, and he's not endorsing every individual ruler or their particular decisions. They are our rulers, but God is in control of everything. That's why he says the power is of God. Okay, because God is in control, and everything that is allowed by God, even something that seems to be harmful to us, like an illness or persecution, is something that God allows for our sake, for our improvement. This is what Paul is saying here. So what does St. John Chrysostom say about this? Okay, he says that, and this is St. John Chrysostom, homily 23 on Romans. And to show that these regulations are for all, even for priests and monks, not only men of secular occupations, he made this plain at the outset by saying as follows: let every soul be subject to the higher powers, even if you are an apostle or an evangelist or a prophet or anything, is inasmuch as, or he means to the extent that, this subjection is not subversive of religion. So Chrysostom understands this to mean that we are to respect and obey our civil authorities as long as it doesn't interfere with our religious expression, our faith and our practice, okay? Chrysostom continuing. For there is no power, he says, but of God. Well, what do you say to that? It may be said, then, is every ruler then elected by God? This I do not say, Paul answers. Nor am I now speaking about individual rulers, but about the thing itself. He means here government, authority, rule. For that there should be rulers, and some rule and others are ruled, and that things should not just be carried on in confusion, people swaying like waves in this direction and that, I say, is the work of God's wisdom. For this reason, Paul does not say, for there is no ruler but of God, but there is no power but of God, and that the powers that be are ordained by God. Can you see what Chrysostom is saying here? So he's not endorsing every individual ruler or government, but the general idea of government, because it gives order to society. And you see how important this is. My goodness, it's so important. So I mentioned how he compares it to marriage. So he says the following. He says that we owe obedience, subjection to our governmental authorities as a debt. We should not fear them if we're not doing something wrong, Chrysostom says. Of course, Paul said something similar to that, okay? So he's speaking here in terms of the general principle, because Chrysostom sees anarchy and confusion as an evil. And if you look at so many countries in the world where there isn't a strong government, and where you have different clans and different gangs and different groups that run rampant and the government cannot control them, you can see how anarchy and confusion and a weak government is a problem. So those of us who live in basic safety and security in most countries, developed countries in the world, don't really appreciate what it means to live in a place where there's anarchy and you don't know who's going to knock at your door and what they're going to do to you, and you have no protection. So this is why St. Paul saw governing authorities as basically good. Now, we have to, again, differentiate between the general rule and particulars. So, for example, this is like the difference between Proverbs and the book of Job. So what does Proverbs say? Proverbs says, and the Psalms say, blessed is the man who fears the Lord, who walks in his ways. You know, his wife will be like a fruitful vine, or he will be like a tree planted by the waters. Whatever he does will prosper, and, you know, he will bear many fruits. So you have this idea in Proverbs and the Psalms, generally speaking, and in much of the Old Testament, that if you do the right thing, God will allow you to prosper. Nothing bad is going to happen to you. And then we have the book of Job, right? Where these terrible things happened to Job, and he didn't do anything to deserve it. So if I were to ask you, if you live a good life, do you always have a good life? If you make the right kinds of choices, do you have a good life? Well, the answer is usually yes, because most of the time, the bad things that happen to us very often are the result of our choices that eventually bear fruit that is, not good. But sometimes that's not always the case. So we have the general rule that if you make good choices in your life, if you're a law-abiding citizen, if you go to church, if you treat people kindly, if you try to cultivate a good marriage, you try to raise good children, most of the time, those things work out for your benefit and things turn out well for you, but not always. We have children who are disobedient. We have spouses sometimes, in spite of our best efforts, who are unfaithful to us. We have governments that abuse us. We have get cancer. We get hit by a bus. Things happen. Bad things happen. But generally speaking, the rule is that if we choose and think wisely about the choices we make in our lives, we usually end up with a pretty good life. So that kind of analogy is the same thing that's going on here. Governments are for our good, and when we are obedient to them and respectful and law-abiding, this usually works for the benefit of everyone in society, because anarchy and confusion are very detrimental. They don't help us. It doesn't help us, okay, to live in a state of anarchy. So this is what Chrysostom says. So Chrysostom says, the ruler is a benefactor to you in the things of greatest importance. He procures peace for you and the blessings of civil institutions, for there are countless blessings to states through these authorities. And if you remove them, all things would go to ruin, and neither city nor country nor private nor public buildings nor anything else would stand, but all the world would be turned upside down, while the more powerful devour the weaker. You see, look at that. Just think of last summer when there were protests that went on in cities, not only in America, but around the world, over the issue of racial injustice, which is a real issue, something to have real concern about. But people used those protests to loot, to rob, to destroy people's buildings and people's houses and people's businesses, and nobody was doing anything about it. Is this the kind of society we want? Or do we want people to obey the authorities? Nobody stepped in to protect in many cases, and instead they were allowed to do whatever they wanted. Is this the kind of culture we want to have? Is this the kind of society we want to have? How can people open a business if they don't know that when they call the police, they're going to protect them? How can they? Why would they invest in a business, in a piece of property, if they can't have confidence in the ruling authorities, in the rule of law? This is really what he's talking about here. So our governments give us benefits, and the existence of government allows us to live in an orderly and peaceful society. And we see what happens when there is no good, strong government or a corrupt government in places in the world. We see the chaos, the hardship, the refugees fleeing for their lives, the lack of safety, the lack of food, the lack of security. And here we are, in most of us listening to this podcast in the West, where we live pretty safe and comfortable lifetimes. We live lives that are fairly safe and comfortable. We can afford to be critical of our government and to question Paul's state of mind, okay, because we're not looking for a strong government. But anarchy is a great evil, and it hampers our life. Now, the church has traditionally been cooperative with authorities. So this is the Christian tradition, and we pray for our rulers during the Divine Liturgy, don't we? We have the petitions. In the United States, we pray for the President of the United States. We don't care who he is. We always pray for the President, right? If you're in England, you're praying for the Queen. Okay, I suppose the Prime Minister, depending upon what country you live. That's part of the Divine Liturgy. That has been the tradition of the Church because it's in the Bible. That's in Paul's epistles, to pray for our authorities. We always pray for our officials. And then later in the Divine Liturgy, we have a petition for everyone in public service. Remember, O Lord, those in public service and permit them to serve and govern in peace. Why? What is the reason? Why do we support our public officials? Not that they're perfect, but we have to support them, respect them, and obey them, so that through the faithful conduct of their duties, we may live peaceful and serene lives in all piety and holiness. Because when our public servants, whether they are elected officials or the police or the fire or just somebody who's a clerk at the county, when you need to file a document or something like this, when they do their job, we live lives of peace and serenity, which allows us to give our attention to God, to have a life of piety. We're not as concerned with simply surviving day to day, with having enough food. So the breakdown of social order is bad for everyone. And this is why Paul is instructing us to submit to authorities. We often don't agree with them, but we aren't supposed to do whatever we please. We are supposed to submit to the authorities to the extent that it doesn't interfere with our faith, okay? So you might say, well, because I just read to you from St. John Chrysostom, you might say, well, Chrysostom is living in a later time, right? When it was a Christian Roman Empire, so of course he would naturally support the ruling fathers. But what about the ruling powers? But what about Christians of earlier times, the ones who lived through persecution and martyrdom? You might say, well, Paul didn't know what was going to happen to him. He was going to be beheaded by Nero, etc., etc. What about Christians who lived through that? Because the church was subject to tremendous persecution by the Roman state, even though this is sometimes people say this never happened. It did happen. We have many accounts of martyrdom. We have many, many martyrs. So what happens in that situation? What did the fathers of earlier eras say about St. Paul's words? Well, one of the earliest quotations or references to this passage comes from the earliest account of a martyrdom outside of the New Testament. Do you know what document that is? Which document contains the earliest description or account of a martyrdom that's outside the New Testament? Of course, in the New Testament, we have the martyrdom of St. Stephen, right, in Acts. So what is the earliest description of a martyrdom that's not? Don't say Ignatius of Antioch. He wrote many epistles on the way to martyrdom, but he didn't describe his own martyrdom. He imagined what might happen, but that's not an account of martyrdom. The earliest written account of a martyrdom is the martyrdom of Polycarp, which took place around the year 160. He was the bishop of Smyrna. He had been bishop of Smyrna for many decades, and he was martyred at the age of 86. He was a disciple of the apostle John and was put to death by the Romans in Smyrna at the age of 86. So there had been a persecution of the Christians of Smyrna, and many of them had been martyred, and but they hadn't found Polycarp. Polycarp had been sent into hiding. He didn't want to go into hiding, but it was very difficult for a church in a town when the bishop was martyred. When the bishop died, it was very, very difficult because there was this lack of leadership in the church, so they wanted their bishops to stay alive. Sometimes bishops were criticized for fleeing to, to the woods or something like this to avoid martyrdom, but it's never wrong. You don't have to sit there and wait to be arrested and put to death. Some bishops were criticized for this, but very often it was the faithful that wanted them to preserve their life. And so Polycarp was in a farmhouse, when he was found, the big mob that had killed a lot of the Christians in Smyrna called for the arrest of Polycarp, whom they called the father of the Christians and the teacher of Asia. He was venerable at age 86, really a saintly old man. So they called for the arrest of Polycarp. The authorities eventually found him, and he was brought to the arena and invited by the proconsul to make his case before the people. And Polycarp answered that he would be happy to make his case before the governor if he was given a hearing, but he was not going to make his case before the mob. The mob was clamoring for his death, of course. And this was a very common problem that Christians faced in the early centuries. They were denied a trial. This happened routinely. If they confessed Christ, they were given 3 chances to deny Christ. If they confessed Christ 3 times, they were taken out and just executed without a trial, without the state proving or establishing what's wrong with believing in Jesus Christ. Why is this a crime? But that was the reality. So this is what Polycarp said to the proconsul. To you, I have thought it right to offer an account of my faith. For we are taught to give all due honor, which entails no injury to ourselves, to the powers and authorities which are ordained of God. That's St. Paul's language. So he says, I will explain myself to you. You're one of the ruling authorities. This is what we are taught as Christians. And he continued and he said, but as for these, he's pointing to the mob, I do not deem them worthy of receiving any account for me. Because of course they weren't interested in listening to Polycarp defend himself. They were calling for his death, and they weren't in authority. So look at that. This is a very early, the year 160, so this is about 100 years after Paul wrote Romans. And we can see by his words that Christians were taught to obey the ruling authorities. That doesn't mean that they were supposed to worship the Roman gods, but as far as was possible, they were supposed to be good citizens. Now, one of Polycarp's disciples was Irenaeus. He was one of the most important of the early fathers of the church, and he became Bishop of Lyon, France, what is now France, then Gaul. Around the year 178, the Bishop of Lyon was martyred by the Romans along with a number of other Christians in the year 177. It's a very, very famous, very moving account of martyrdom. If you've never read these things, you must read these things. It's the martyrs of Vienne and Lyon in southern Gaul, and a number of Christians were put to death, and one of them was the bishop. He was also an elderly man. So Irenaeus comes to Lyon and becomes the bishop of that area, and he wrote of his most famous important work called Against Heresies. And Irenaeus is refuting, in this passage I'm going to read for you, he's refuting the claim that the kingdoms of the world or the governments are from the devil, okay? Even though we sometimes feel like that with our own government, right? He's refuting this. And by the way, some people were saying in Greece that you shouldn't get COVID vaccine because that's from the devil. Irenaeus would not agree with that, okay? Here's Irenaeus. He says, pay tribute also, for they are God's ministers doing service for this very thing. He's quoting from Romans 13 here. This also the Lord confirmed when he did not do what he was tempted to do by the devil, but gave directions that the tribute should be paid to the tax gatherers for himself and Peter, because they are ministers of God. That's that little story I told you about. For since man, this is Irenaeus, by departing from God, reached such a pitch of fury as to even look upon his brother as his enemy, and engage without fear in every kind of reckless conduct and murder and avarice, God imposed upon mankind the fear of man, since they did not acknowledge the fear of God. Think about that. Since we don't fear God, God allowed human governments, and for us to fear the government, to behave ourselves out of fear of the government, because we don't fear God. That's a great point, because ideally, if we all feared God, we wouldn't need a government. We would all do the right thing. So continuing with Irenaeus, God imposed on mankind the fear of man, he means the ruling authorities, since they did not acknowledge the fear of God, in order that, being subjected to the authority of men and kept under restraint by their laws, they might attain to some degree of justice and exercise mutual forbearance through dread of the sword, suspended in their full view, as the apostle says. For he's quoting Romans here again. For he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is a minister of God, the avenger of wrath upon him who does evil. Unquote. For this reason, too, this is Irenaeus, magistrates themselves, having laws as a clothing of righteousness, whenever they act in a just and legitimate manner, shall not be called into question for their conduct, nor be liable to punishment. But whatever they do to the subversion of justice, iniquity and impiety and illegally and tyrannically, in these things they shall perish. For the just judgment of God comes equally upon all. Think about that. What did you think he was going to say? Did you think he was going to say, if they're acting with iniquitously or impiously or tyrannically, we don't have to obey them? Did he say that? He did not say that. He said they will be punished for this, because God is going to punish everybody. Everybody has to account to themselves for God. So we're not supposed, even when we think the government is doing the wrong thing, we're not supposed to take it upon ourselves to disobey them. Because here he says the rulers, if they're acting in the wrong manner, they will have to answer to God for that. Continuing with Irenaeus, earthly rule, therefore, has been appointed by God for the benefit of nations, and not by the devil, who is never at rest at all, no, who does not love to see the nations conducting themselves quietly, so that under the fear of human rule, men may not eat each other up like fishes, but that, by means of the establishment of laws, they may keep down an excess of wickedness among the nations. And considered from this point of view, those who exact tribute from us are, quote, God's ministers serving this purpose, unquote. There he's quoting St. Paul. So look at what he says, that because we don't obey God, God has allowed for governments, human governance, so at least we might be kept in check by other human beings. So how are Christians to behave in relation to the government if called to service? If you are called to public service, either as an elected official or as a police officer, this is a noble thing. You're called to serve honorably, to serve well. The purpose of the church is not to endorse one political party or a government or something like this, but to simply live peaceably as much as we can, as best we can, with the governing authorities, because the church exists to save souls. And what we want to have in our lives is a life of peace and tranquility, so that we can do the ministry of the church, so that we can live a life of peace, right? This is what we are called to do. So there you have it. Chrysostom agrees with Irenaeus, who agrees with Polycarp. That's what I mean when I say that we must interpret these things according to the tradition of the church. Look at all the different opinions I gave you at the beginning of this program, the different opinions by different Bible scholars who cannot understand this passage. Okay? But from the earliest years of the church, Christians understood what Paul was getting at. And the understanding of this passage, how and why we are supposed to be subject to ruling authorities, how Christians were to understand that and live their lives, was well understood by the Christians. Look at what Polycarp said. We are taught to be obedient to our rulers, to give them honor, to pay our taxes. That was part of your instruction as a Christian. So Christians were not being instructed to be subversive, but they were also not expected to obey the rulers in all matters, to worship the Greek gods and the Roman gods and that sort of thing. So how did we arrive at the meaning of the passage? By looking at it in its context and by applying the tradition of the church, which is the same, what Polycarp was saying is exactly what Paul was saying. What Irenaeus said was what Polycarp said. What Chrysostom said was what Irenaeus said. Can you see the chain of tradition? This is why we don't rely on our own opinions and our own imaginations, but rely on the consistent interpretation of the church in all of these passages. And it's quite remarkable that you do not find disagreement among the fathers of the church. Why disagreement? There's some little disagreements about interpretation of some passages, but generally speaking, the church is consistent in its understanding of these things because this is what we were taught by the apostles. You don't think anybody asked Paul during his lifetime about how they're supposed to react to government authorities? You don't think that was ever a subject of discussion when Paul met with the Thessalonians or the Romans or the Corinthians? You don't think that was ever? And by the way, there were Christians who were members of the governing and the ruling class. At the end of Romans, we will see Paul mention Gaius and Quartus, people who were involved in the government of the city of Corinth. So Christians were also a part of the ruling class in the Roman Empire. So this question of how we are supposed to engage with government was something that was discussed among the Christians, and they understood what Paul meant by that. That understanding was passed along as Christians were catechized. That is apostolic tradition. Okay? So we've reached the end of our time tonight. Next week, we will continue with our discussion of chapter 13. There are beautiful statements about love and how love is the fulfillment of the law. I hope we can finish chapter 13. We'll see. But also, there's a very beautiful passage that was extremely important in the life of St. Augustine in chapter 13. And we'll talk about that next time, okay? So for now, let's close with our prayer. Lord, now let your servants depart in peace according to your word, for our eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared before the face of all peoples, a light to enlighten the Gentiles and the glory of your people, Israel. Amen. Good night.